Alright, hello and welcome to the MMO development class week 2. I'm here and my name is Nelson. So what we're going to be doing today is continuing where we left off last week. Last week was pretty straightforward, just in that all we were doing was getting some basic configuration stuff set up. But this week I want to do, well, let's start working on something a little bit more interesting. Like I said before in the class, I just want to make this disclaimer again. The whole idea of this is just to go ahead and build some fun stuff while people are kind of watching and hanging out. So in the spirit of that, I'm not exactly sure what code I'm going to be ending up with today, but let's go ahead and write it anyway. What I want to accomplish is I want to get a registration form and a login form done. So I want to be able to have players be able to register an account with the server and to be able to log in to those accounts. So that's going to require that I set up some database action, get some basic UI for the client, although that's not a concern, a very large concern at this point, but it's going to require us to go ahead and worry a little bit about security, password storage, account storage, and how we can log into things, as well as how I'm going to be handling the database interaction. So we are going to be using MySQL, or I'm going to be using MySQL. Whatever you guys use is up to you, really. The ORM I'm going to be using is in Hibernate, which means that you can pretty much, if you follow along with this code, you can use virtually any database backend that you want. So, yeah, let's go ahead and get some stuff going. So what I'm going to do is, the first thing we need to be able to do is store stuff in the database. So I guess the first step in order to do that is to create a database. So I'm going to fire up my little MySQL workbench. MySQL Workbench is the application I primarily use for database administration. It's not the best program in the world, but it allows you to do the stuff that you need to be able to do. So I guess that's all that matters. I'm going to go ahead and log into my local database here off screen, so you guys can't see all the super secret connections I have stored for 3D Buzzwork. And let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a schema. And I'm going to go ahead and call this dev RuneSlinger. And I'm going to give it a correlation of UTF general case insensitive. I do believe that's actually the server default, but I've had so many problems with, if you've ever worked with databases for an extended period of time, you will know that working with correlations and character sets is absolutely obnoxious, so I always like to double check it for some reason. I don't know, it's kind of like an OCD thing. So now that I've created my schema, I'm going to go ahead and close all my super secret SQL tabs, refresh over here so that it sorts properly. Let's open it up and let's just create a table real fast. I'm just going to create how about a users table? It seems like a sensible thing to create given that we're working with authentication. We're going to go back to this table here shortly, but for now I'm just going to fill it up with some stuff that I think would be appropriate for what we're wanting to do. So let's give it an ID, make it the primary key, not nullable, unsigned, and auto increment. Let's do a email. Varchar 256, not nullable, and unique. So giving it the unique constraint will not only make it unique, a database constraint to make this column unique, but it'll also index this column. Now I am going to be having people log in through email. That's kind of the thing that I always do with any application that I write, whether it's a game or a website or anything like that. I always like having people log in with emails. I feel that a person is less likely to forget their email than they are to forget their username, because it's very easy to forget a username, but it's not very easy to forget an email. So I find that requiring that people log in with an email is more appropriate. Then I'm going to give them a username. Username is going to have a constraint of 256 characters, and it's also going to be unique. Then let's go ahead and give it, and of course it's not nullable. Then I'm going to go ahead and give it a created at. That's just some column I typically just add just for the heck of it whenever I create a table. So ID, email, username, created at. Let's give it I know we're going to need a password salt. We'll talk about that here in a moment. let's make our password salt. Do I want to store it in ASCII or in UTF-8, or do I want to store it in binary? Let's go ahead and store it in UTF-8, why not? So I'm going to make this a varchar32, not nullable, and then let's create a password hash. And forgive me, I totally forgot what the width of SHA-1 is, so give me 1 second as I look at the Wikipedia page of SHA-1. SHA-1 is... how big are you? SHA-1 length. Oh, come on. Come on, does anybody know how long a SHA-1 is? I completely forgot. It's something I should have memorized, but you know, sometimes I'm bad at this game. Whatever. I'm not going to waste time looking for SHA-1. So I'm just going to go ahead and say password hash. I'm going to give this a varchar, let's see, maybe 128 characters, if represented as a hex string. I don't know, but if this is not the case, we'll get an error when we try to do something with it. So I'm going to make this not null. I'm going to hit apply, and we now have a users table. Actually, we don't. We don't have a users table because my email has a unique constraint, and unfortunately, MySQL does not support having a unique constraint on a field that's this long, or more appropriately, an index that's this long. So I'm going to dump this down to 200 characters, I'm going to dump that down to 128. If a person has a username longer than 128, then they have problems. Alrighty, I have a users table. So now that I've created a schema and I've created a table, what's the first thing you should do when you go ahead and want to make this table accessible to a program? Anybody? Come on, you guys should know this. No, you should not have a party. Out of habit, I'm going to go ahead and create a user that is specific to that table. So I'm going to go ahead and call this dev RuneSlinger, give it a localhost constraint, give it a password. Let's see. To do this, I typically just Google random password generator. Generate password. Here we go. I'm going to fire up a Sublime text window off screen here and keep that open. So there we go. Going to make sure you guys know administrative roles. Apply. Go down to schema privileges. Select dev RuneSlinger. Say add entry. Constrain it to localhost, and then give it permissions to dev RuneSlinger. Select all in quotes, which selects all but grant. Save changes. And now I have a user that I can use to access this database. So that's all a bunch of fun stuff. Now let's go about seeing how we can actually access this database from within our program. So what we're going to need to do is get some hibernate action up here. So I'm going to jump into NuGet, search for hibernate, pull hibernate down. Then I'm going to also pull down MySQL.data. The reason I'm pulling down MySQL.data is that although I do believe MySQL.data is added to the global assembly cache of my local computer, it may very well not be to where I deploy it to. So I typically like to bundle the MySQL ADO connector with whatever application I'm deploying to a server anywhere. So now that we have that, again, just in the spirit of keeping things simple, because right now we're just writing the simplest code possible in order to accomplish a goal, and we'll start to notice patterns and other things we can refactor out later. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and create a class that I can use to map to my table. So I'm going to create a namespace called entities, make sure I spell that right, and then I'm going to create an entity called user, and let's go ahead and create our user entity. What I find useful for this is to just go ahead and bring down my MySQL workbench and my Visual Studio side by side and get some class writing action going on. So let me go ahead and inspect this table so I can remember the data types I used. So our ID is a public, it's going to be public virtual uint ID, and I have overwrite mode enabled for some reason. Keep in mind, one caveat is not all our DBMSs support unsigned data types. Most notably, MySQL or Microsoft SQL Server does not support unsigned data types. So actually, this is a case where this code isn't going to be compatible with MySQL. To make it compatible with MySQL, you would just use an int instead of a uint. So then I'm going to go ahead and do a public virtual string email, public virtual string username, public virtual date time. And if you guys want to go ahead and another fun little trick, again, always remember that control space is not very helpful when compared to control alt space. So to get a date time, notice how I do not have a using system up here. I can just hit control alt space, or shift alt space, sorry, D time, and hit space, and I get a using system up there. So it's just a little fast way to do that. So I'm going to add a created.property. Then let's go ahead and password salt. Actually, what I'm going to do in this case, I'm going to create a component. So let's jump down here, create a value objects namespace. Inside of value objects, I'm going to create a password hash, or sorry, a hashed password. Hash password is going to take in a password hash and a that word password is redundant, so a hash and a salt. Create two properties. Then, because I'm going to be mapping this value object within Hibernate, I'm going to have to create a parameterless constructor. However, I'm going to make that parameterless constructor private because I don't want anybody else other than in Hibernate to be able to access it. I'm going to add a little documentation here saying for in Hibernate. So again, I have a very simple data object that I'm going to use to carry around a hash and a salt for a password. I'll extend this class further in a little bit to make it a little bit more robust. But for now, we're just going to leave it as a straightforward class like this. So then I'm going to do public virtual hashed password. Finally, I'm going to move my created at field to the bottom just because I typically like my auditing fields to be kind of grouped elsewhere than my actual type. So this is really all you would need to do in order, at a basic level, all you need to do in order to get this class to persist to this table, other than the additional ceremony that we're going to have to perform to work within Hibernate. So we need to spool up in Hibernate configuration, we need to map this class to our table, and then we'll be able to use this class as essentially a proxy to rows within this table, which should be lots of fun. So I already do have in Hibernate referenced as a NuGet package. So now what I'm going to do is get the configuration all spooled up for it. And also I'm going to create a mapping that will tell in Hibernate how it's going to map this class to this table. I'm going to do that one first. And within Hibernate, and Hibernate now includes mapping by code. Previously you had to write this ugly XML file in order to do this, but now in Hibernate comes bundled with a way we can do all of the in Hibernate configuration via code. And you do that in the form of a class mapping. And a class mapping is just a class that inherits from class mapping, not surprisingly. Now the class mapping is going to contain a constructor, and this constructor is what's going to be used to tell in Hibernate how it's going to map to this table. First thing I need to do is tell Hibernate what table it is this entity should map to. Now keep in mind, this class mapping of user is very important. This of user part tells Hibernate which entity I'm mapping. So I'm mapping a user. So the first thing I do is I need to tell it what table. I'm going to tell it users. Next thing I need to do is tell it what is the identifier column, and in this case, what it's generated by. A generator of identity means that this is going to be generated by the database. So then I have to map my email. I'm going to say email is not nullable because email is not nullable. I'm going to map my username. Email username is not nullable. Then I'm going to map my password. Now password is going to be a little bit more complex because a password is not a basic type. It's not a string or a uint or a date time or anything like that. It's a custom type that I've written myself. So let me go ahead and get these two files up on the screen at the same time so we can kind of see what's going on with this. In Hibernate terms, a non-primitive type that you want to map is called a component. So I'm going to say component, password, and then I'm going to open up a multi-line lambda that'll allow me to configure that component. So how do I configure this component? Well, this Y object now contains the exact same methods like property that will allow me to map these properties to tables or to columns. So let's do that. Let's see. The name of the salt column is password underscore salt, and it is non-nullable. So to map that, I do y.property, and then let's do x goes into hash. Let's do salt first because that's listed first in the database. And then we're going to have to map this to a column of password salt. And there's some crazy lag going on here, so excuse my typing, which is non-nullable. And let's go ahead and do my hash. And let's make it non-nullable. So I've mapped my password, my email, my username, my ID. So the last thing that I need to map is my created at. Now, keep in mind something that you guys might not notice off the top or off the bat here is that this and Hibernate will provide defaults for most everything. So for example, the table is defaulted to the entity name, but I had to override that default because my table is not named user, it's called users. Also noticed how right here, I say I'm mapping this email, but I don't say what column I'm mapping this email property to. And Hibernate will default that to the column named by the property. And because SQL is case insensitive, that's fine. So this will map my email property to the email column. However, I have to override that name here and here because these two property names do not correspond to the column names. Then notice also when I have to send in multiple overrides into the mapping, I have to use a multi-line lambda as opposed to these single line lambdas when I just have one instruction to send in. So that's why the created at, I'm going to have to send two instructions in because not only am I overriding the name, I'm also overriding its nullability. And there's a cat in my room. I have to go kick her out or she's going to drive me insane. Out. Out. Okay. So that's great. This is pretty much most of the stuff that we need to do to get this to work in Hibernate. The last thing we need to do is actually configure in Hibernate. I know I'm kind of jumping around here, but like I said, you guys are getting a look into how I approach things, and When it's stuff like this, I tend to jump around quite a bit. So the last thing I need to do is actually configure NHibernate. Now, NHibernate is fairly straightforward. We have what's called a session factory, and the session factory creates sessions, and a session has transactions in it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to, every time a request comes into the server, I'm going to create a new database session, because sessions are very cheap to create in NHibernate. However, I still need to create the session factory and configure it, because otherwise, how is NHibernate going to know that this user map is going to be added or used to map to this particular database, which I have right here? So that's what we're going to do next. To do that, the easiest way to do that is to configure the bulk of NHibernate using an app.config file. So let's go ahead and add an app.config file to my project. So that's just going to be a application configuration file. And now we have an application configuration file. So the next step is to open up a project in which you already have NHibernate configured on and copy and paste the XML. So if you guys aren't familiar with app.config files or web.config files, there's a lot of stuff that you can configure with it by default, like the runtime and assembly redirects and all that fun stuff. But when you want to configure like something like NHibernate, you have to tell the app.config file that you are wanting to configure NHibernate. I know it's kind of weird. Why can't you just tell it, hey, I want to configure NHibernate with this configuration? But no, you have to separate it out into two sections. The first section is a config sections element. Now, config sessions must be at the top or the beginning of your app.config file, right underneath your configuration element. Then you paste in whatever you have already written at some point. So what I'm saying here is I'm saying, okay, I want to have a configuration section called Hibernate Configuration, and I want it to be provided by nhibernate.cfg.configuration section handler, located at the NHibernate DLL. So that's the first step. The second step is to actually go in and paste in your actual Hibernate configuration element. So in this case, I already have a configuration set up for MySQL. Actually, I don't really, because I overrode the client driver. So if you guys don't have this code right here, what you would want to do is, if you guys haven't worked with NHibernate before, you can jump into, if I recall correctly, the packages and Hibernate, and you can go into configuration templates, and it'll give you a configuration template for a variety of different database engines. So if you look at the mysql.config.xml, it'll contain the two things that you care about. The first thing is going to be the driver class. So we need the driver class. I pasted this code in from a project where I overrode the driver class, so I'm going to set it back to the default for MySQL. Then you also need to make sure that your dialect is set correctly. And my dialect is set correctly to the MySQL dialect. Obviously, if you're using a different database engine, you'd have different parameters here. The ADO net batch size is actually irrelevant, and I don't even know why it's in my other configuration file, because it's only used for MSSQL. So I'm going to nuke that one. Generate statistics helps the profiler, the NHibernate profiler, profile your NHibernate code. So I'm going to leave that in. The last thing of importance is your connection string name. Now there's two ways to provide a connection string to NHibernate, and a connection string is just it's a combination of where your database server is, what username and what password to use to get into your database server. So there's two ways to provide that connection string to NHibernate. You can either provide it directly in your Hibernate configuration, like what you see over here on the right hand side, or you can provide a connection string name and then give it a name of a connection string. And a connection string is configured within this file under connection strings, not surprisingly. With add, give it a name, let's give it a name of main.db, and then a connection string of this is something I always forget. Yeah, let's go ahead and just paste you over here and then fill in your values. So my database is going to be, what was it again? Dev RuneSlinger. My data source is going to be localhost because that's where my MySQL server is located at. User ID is going to be dev RuneSlinger. And my password is going to be the super secret password I pasted over here off screen of that. So there's my database, my data source, my user ID, and my password. There's quite a few other parameters you can pass into connection strings for MySQL, but we're not going to worry about them right now. So this is all the XML configuration you need to work within Hibernate. So now we have the bulk of the configuration set up. We have a configuration of how we want in Hibernate to work with this class, and we have the configuration of how we want in Hibernate to connect to our database. There's one last step, and the last step is to connect these two things together, to actually instantiate in Hibernate and say, okay, in Hibernate, I want you to use this configuration information, and I want you to use this mapping. Take those two things, mash them together, and let me... I mistyped something. Dev RuneSlinger? RuneSlinger. Okay, so yeah, we need to go ahead and instruct in Hibernate, take this file, take this class, mash them together, and give me an object that I can use to persist this entity to my database. That's called a session factory, and we create a session factory through an object called a configuration, or a class called a configuration, which is probably the worst name for a class they could have chosen. Alrighty, so let's go ahead and do that in the setup method. I don't want to do it in the constructor just because, to be honest, I don't know exactly where in the Photon pipeline the constructor is invoked, but I do know that the setup is invoked right about the time where my program should be kind of getting things running. So again, I don't know if I should use the constructor for this just because I don't know exactly where the pipeline, the constructor is actually invoked. So let's go ahead and get an Hibernate set up. So like I said, we need an object. Actually, I'm just going to write a method called configure setup. See, I can't type with this lag. Set up and Hibernate. So just to keep things nice and clean, I'm going to write a little method called setup and Hibernate. Inside this method, I'm going to, well, set up and Hibernate. So the first thing I need is a configuration. And a configuration object or class is provided to us by the hibernate.cfg namespace. All right, so the first thing I need to do is say config.configure. Config.configure is another horribly named thing. And honestly, this whole process is very horribly named, to be honest. But what config.configure does is it says if you don't provide any parameters into it or any arguments into it, what it's going to do is it's going to say, okay, in Hibernate, I want you to look at my app.config, find a Hibernate configuration section, and then use these options to build me a session factory. So that's what it does. Config.configure just says, go look at my app.config. The next thing we need to do is actually instruct and Hibernate as to which mappings we want. Now, very soon here, I'll write a little thing that'll scan my assembly and find all my class mapping stuff so I don't have to do this manually. But for the sake of clarity, I'm going to go ahead and add this user mapping straight into my configuration. And to do that, you need a little bit of code that I have only written once in my life and copied and pasted every single other time I've needed it. So give me 1 second as I hunt that down. And yes, this will be a recurring theme throughout the course of this class. Because I can't remember these type names, they're awful. What do I need? I need a model mapper. Okay, so let's create a mapper. Ooh, that's a good question. I'll answer in a second. Okay, so I need a model mapper class, and then what I'm going to do is say mapper.addMapping user map. Then I'm going to say config.addMapping mapper.compile mapping for all explicitly added entities. Seriously, you can't make this stuff up. Okay, so I've done my 2 steps. I've told nHibernate where to get my database configuration from, and I've told nHibernate where to get my class mappings from. So that's it. Now I can get a nice little fancy session factory. So I'm going to create a field in my application class of iSessionFactory, and I'm going to call it _sessionFactory. So you guys see I have this little field up here now because I want to keep my session factory around. Then I'm going to say session factory equals config dot, what is it, build session factory. There we go. And that's it. I can now create sessions, and I can now persist objects to my user table without having to do any additional work. And again, I haven't forgotten about that question as far as how does it know where the config file is. I'll get to that in a second. But first I want to prove to you guys that I actually made this work. So in my setup method, I'm going to write some test code just to prove to you guys that this is working right. So I'm going to say using var session equals session factory dot open session, using var trans equals session dot begin transaction, var user equals new user. Let's give him username of Nelson, an email of nelson@3buzz.com. Let's give him a created at of datetime.utc-now. Let's give him a password of a new hashed password of hash and salt. Then I'm going to say session.saveUser and then trans.commit. So this is the minimum amount of code that you need to write to get something persisted into nHibernate. And it's actually a lot simpler than it looks, because if I was using straight up SQL, it would be a whole lot uglier. Because keep in mind, nHibernate not only handles things like type conversions, but it also handles security, like preventing SQL injection and all that fun stuff. So let's go ahead and see what happened. I'm going to go ahead and build this guy and see him start up. Ooh, guess what? I forgot to start Photon. One more quick thing. I am using a little Visual Studio plugin called .NET Daemon. I'm going to disable it. I'm going to keep save continuously on, but I'm going to disable that and that. And the reason I am is because I don't want every single change I write to cause Photon to re-spool up my application. But if you guys don't have .NET Daemon installed, then don't worry about what I just said. So I'm going to right-click on Photon Control, go to Default, Start as Application, and let's watch our logs and see what happens. And somehow I've managed to keep pretty much all of you in the last 50 minutes. That's surprising. Okay, application started. So because we got to the application started, that means I should have a nice little user row in my database. And hey, look at that. Everything is mapped properly, configured properly, and all that stuff, and I did that all on my first try. Whoa, go me. I don't hear anyone clapping. All right, thanks. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and delete this code. Again, the only reason I wrote this code was just to verify that Hibernate was working. So, wait, how does it know where the config file is? That's a good question. app.config. Fine. Here's a user file. But while you look at this file, I'm going to explain what's going on with this app.config. App.config is a very, very special file. And it's a file that actually exists for every single .NET executable or website. Well, in the case of a website, it's a web.config, not an app.config. but it's a very special configuration file that you all should be familiar with. What it is it allows you to override everything, and it also provides a way for you to provide custom configuration options to things like Hibernate or other things like Log4net if you wanted to. Now, I did split the Log4net configuration out of my app.config for a reason, but for Hibernate, I want it to be my app.config. When you compile a Visual Studio project using MS Build, and you have an app.config file on your in the root of your project, what MS Build does is it actually copies that app.config file to wherever you built your project to. So in this case, we built our project to right into my Photon deploy folder. So it's under deploy, blah, 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 RuneSlinger bin. And see what it turned into? It turned into runeslinger.server.dll.config. So my app.config file just got copied and renamed. When the .NET runtime loads an assembly and it finds a .config file that's the same name as the assembly, it attaches this configuration file to that assembly. Now you can do all sorts of fun stuff with the configuration files. You can even add your own custom configuration. In fact, if we go back into the deploy in Win64 Photon server.config, actually in this case that's not right. This is not being, I don't think this config file is being loaded by the .NET assembly or .NET runtime, but this one is. Here's an example of another config file, the photon control.exe.config. So again, this is something that gets sent along with pretty much every single .NET project. And when you compile an app.config, it just gets turned into your assembly name .config, and it gets loaded by the .NET runtime. So for example, maybe I wanted to add some custom user settings to this. I can add an element here called app settings, and I can go ahead and add an app setting with a key of whoa and a value of bleh. And then on my application.cs, what I can do is I can say application start, and then let's do like a log.info configuration. I'm going to fail at this, and the reason I'm going to fail at this, there we go, configuration manager, app settings, whoa. So I can do configuration manager.app settings with a key of whoa, and then when I build this, okay, when I build this harder, we get bleh printed out because it was able to load up this app setting from the configuration file. So to answer your question concisely, now that you have all that background information, and Hibernate knows where the config file is because the config file is a built-in aspect of .NET, and it knows where to look at it, to look for it from at. Words hard. All right, so how's everyone doing? Oh, everybody else got all silent. Oh, there we go. Okay, well, it's been almost an hour, and I'm almost out of words here, so I'm going to go ahead and step outside and grab some water, and then I'll be back, and let's go ahead and put this users table to use now that we have managed to be able to connect with it with our application. So, go ahead and... Okay, so we've got a couple questions. The first one is, someone asked a little while ago if my session factory would be a candidate for dependency injection. The answer is no. You should not inject your session factory into your IOC container. And the reason is what you should do instead is to inject your sessions into your IOC container. Keep in mind, a session factory, all a session factory is it's a combination of your database configuration and your class mappings. The actual object that's responsible for talking to the database is an iSession, not an iSession factory. So we would want to inject the iSession, not the iSession factory. We also got a question about what's the industry standard dependency injection for .NET. The short answer to that is there is none. I use AutoFac because AutoFac has all the features I need. It's very quick and it's very stable and it's very well documented. A lot of people like using Castle Windsor. Some people like using ninject. Some people like using Unity, which it's funny, Microsoft has a project called Unity, but that's a dependency injection project, not the engine. So I'm sure most of you have run into situations where Googling for bugs in Unity has landed you on some sort of Microsoft documentation page, and that's why. We also got questions about how do we manage the database with source control. I could write a book about that, and there actually have been books written about that. It's a very complicated subject and is going to be dependent on the project at hand, how complex you want the project to be. Do you have people responsible for things like database integrity and stuff like that? Like, do you have a dedicated DBA dude just hanging around waiting to fix your database when the application developers break it, and so on? The way I do it is I usually create a, at some point, I will create a SQL file that represents the base schema and default data that my program needs to run. Then to deploy the application for the first time, you would take that SQL file and you would add it to your database or execute it on your database. Then from that point on, I would use migration scripts. So every time I wanted to add a new table or add a new column, I would create a migration script that would be run the next time my application is deployed to a server. And so that's how I would handle that sort of stuff. It's a very complex, very messy, very tricky subject, and it's very obnoxious in my opinion, but once you get some basic things figured out, like how you want to deal with migrations, it can be made relatively fluid. So does that answer your guys' questions? Yeah, no, do it all and show us. I'm not going to be focusing on that aspect today, just because that aspect is going to be something that I would want an entire 2-hour time block to focus on. Right now we have about an hour left, so what I want to do instead is actually make our and hibernate stuff do things, and that will be important, especially for people who may be less familiar with this sort of stuff. So yeah, on that note, let's go ahead and make our and hibernate stuff do things. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to jump into my rune here. Now the on operation request, I'm going to go ahead and nuke everything on operation request. And the reason is because we are going to be replacing this with our own code. This method is going to go through a lot of revisions as we work through this program. It's going to be simple at first, but it's going to be getting more complicated. So if people remember from last week, the onOperationRequest method is invoked every time the peer or the client requests to the server that something needs to happen. So what are the two things that we need to worry about? Let's actually break into three things. We need to worry about user registration, user authentication, which is the login, and sending a message. So we have three commands that we want to be able to send to our server. Now there are a variety of ways to do this, and I'm going to go ahead and write a quick and dirty way, and then I'll think about it over the next week of how I want to make it a little bit nicer, and we'll work on it at that point. So what's the quick and dirty way to do this? Well, I need to be able to distinguish three operation codes. If you remember, we have this operation request object that has an operation code, which is a byte. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an enumeration that's shared between my client and my server that will represent which three operations we can send to the server. So to do that, I'm going to create a new project. Okay, so for people who are paying attention and have paid close attention to everything that I've said so far, especially RuneSlinger, RuneSlinger.base. So I'm giving this project RuneSlinger.base, and I'm going to make it a class library. But here's the thing. This class library needs to be shared between Unity and Photon. So what is the one thing on this screen that is going to cause that to be problematic? There's one thing that on this screen is going to cause us problems when trying to share this library between Unity and Photon. And this is something that will bite you, so I'm trying to make it very clear to people. Yep, and that's pretty much it, our .NET version. We need to make this assembly compatible with Unity and Photon. Now, Photon is perfectly happy to work with .NET 4.5 assemblies, but Unity will choke on them. So we need to dump this guy back to 3.5 and hit OK. Now, if people were paying really, really, really close attention, well, I'm not going to worry about that, actually. I'll take a look at it and see if it's messy. Okay, it's a bit messy. I'm going to fix this. It automatically created a solution-wide debug configuration. I'm going to nuke that. So I just have debug Nelson and release. I'll leave this at debug because I don't want to, this project doesn't need to be made specific to environments. So I'm just going to say debug and hit close. And then I'm going to delete class 1, and then I'm going to create an enumeration called operation code, or how about Rune operation code. That's just because I think there is an operation code enumeration somewhere in Photon, if I'm not mistaken. I don't want any conflicts. So we need register, login, and send message. Again, this is very, very quick and dirty. That's the whole point of this. We just want to write the minimum code required to make this work, and we'll worry about refactoring it later. So now we have a project, but we have a problem. I can go ahead now and reference my RuneSlinger.base from RuneSlinger.server by right-clicking references, hit add reference, and select RuneSlinger.base. Yes, and how do you say your name? Solution. Okay. Solution, yes. What we need to do is we need to make our RuneSlinger.base build into a directory that's inside of our Unity project. Now, if you guys recall from last week, any project, any DLL that I place inside of my project automatically gets added. So I have this cool little assemblies folder, but the problem with assemblies is I don't believe he's being ignored by Git. Let me check my Git ignore and see if that's even true. I can't even remember. Let's see. Yes. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to create a new folder inside of my project, inside of Unity, called _assemblies. What's going to go in _assemblies are assemblies that are built by my project. The important distinction between the assemblies folder and the _assemblies folder is the _assemblies folder is not going to be checked into source control because it's unnecessary to check this into source control. So now I'm going to jump back into my RuneSlinger project, right-click on my RuneSlinger.base, go to properties, and set his build to that folder. So let's figure out what that folder is going to be. Now, by default, this build is going to be relative to this directory. So I need to go up 1, up 2, into Unity. So let's do that first. Up 1, up 2, into Unity, into assets, and then into _assemblies. Now, that's the cool thing about having the Unity project and the Visual Studio project bundled into the same source control repository, is that I can now use just the relative paths to deal with this sort of stuff, and I don't have to worry about absolute pathing and other issues like that. So now when I hit Control-Shift-B and I jump into Unity, notice how Unity will now import my RuneSlinger.base. It'll import both my DLL and my PDB. That means that if I open up my game manager in Visual Studio, what Unity is going to do is it's going to say, oh wait, there's a DLL now being built into one of my folders. I'm now going to add a reference to that DLL into the CS project that I generate for Visual Studio. And we can verify that by opening up my references and seeing that RuneSlinger.base is now being imported. So this is a very handy way for dealing with code that's shared between Unity and non-Unity projects. So I'm going to leave this open for now. Let's go out and actually write some code now on the server side. But does that make sense to everyone? Does anybody have any problems with what I just did? Figure out who is, there we go. Let's minimize you. Or is everybody just asleep by now? Or did my BuzzNet freeze? Who wrote BuzzNet anyway? How do we output it to Photon 2? We don't need to. That's the cool thing. Because I added it to a reference, by default, all of my non-framework references, if I right-click, go to properties, it's going to have this property called copy local set to true. So what's going to happen is when I hit Control-Shift-B, the first thing that's going to happen is RuneSlinger.base is going to be built. It's going to be added to my Unity assemblies folder. Then RuneSlinger.server is going to be built. RuneSlinger.server will make a copy of my RuneSlinger.base assembly and send it wherever my RuneSlinger.server is being sent to, which I can prove to everybody by jumping into software, Photon, deploy, RuneSlinger, bin, and we see RuneSlinger.base right here. So this is a little way that I've figured out how to manage all the assemblies and stuff with Photon and .NET and Unity. So now that we have our Rune operation code enumeration being shared between my server and my client, I can now write code inside of my Rune peer that takes advantage of that. So again, this can be quick and dirty. I'm going to say if operation request dot operation code equals Rune operation code dot register, and of course I'm going to have to cast this into a byte. Actually, I'm going to make this enum have a backing type of a byte, so that's just a colon byte added to my enum to give it that backing type, which will make this code still fail because it's miserably awful. So let me go ahead and do that anyway. Feels a little bit redundant, I know, but that's just the way .NET is. Else if operation request operation code equals byte Rune operation code dot login. Else if operation code blah 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 byte dot send it. You know what? This is getting ridiculous. What I'm going to do instead is I'm just going to say var opcode equals Rune operation code operation request operation code. Or actually, what I can do. Hold on, I haven't worked with. I'm going to do a try parse. No, I'm not. That's dumb. Yep. Nope. Ignore me. I'm just going to do this. Make the code a little bit less ugly. I mean, it still is pretty ugly, but whatever. This code doesn't need to be pretty, because we're going to be ripping it to shreds here in the upcoming weeks. Because switches are the tools of the devil. Frankly, I just think else ifs look prettier. Okay, so next up what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap all of this code inside of a using statement. I'm going to say, well, first of all, let's go ahead and just yank out some of the parameters. So I'm going to say var username equals operation request dot parameters username. And I know that this isn't the best way to do this at all. Oh, come on, are you kidding me? Oh, right, they're bytes, aren't they? I'm going to create another enum called Rune Operation Code Parameter. And I'm going to have a username, a password, an email. What else do I need? I totally forgot what's in this table already. We have a username, password, and email. And then I'm also going to add a message. Make this have a backing type of a byte. And again, not the most optimal or pretty way to do this, but I just want this code to work. So that's going to be Rune Operation Code Parameter .username, and it's going to be casted into a string, which will throw an exception if the client sends something stupid. So keep in mind, I will be handling exceptions here in a moment. I'm purposefully writing this code so that it will throw an exception if something goes wrong. So keep that in mind before you start judging me. And I'm looking at you, Christian. And I know you're here too, by the way. But I don't see you in BuzzNet. Again, this lag is absolutely killing me and making it almost impossible for me to type. Okay, so my username, password, and email. My login is going to require a password and email. And my send message is going to require a message. Okay, so now I have my three operations kind of stubbed out here. I don't really like the way that this code is looking, just because it's going to start to get very messy. So I'm going to break them out into three different methods. But the first thing I'm going to do is keep in mind the code we're looking at right now is the code that's going to be invoked when the client tells the server to do something. So we're writing the server-side code here. Every time the server sends an operation request to the client sends an operation request to my server, what I want to do is I want to open up a database session and then open up a transaction. And then if an exception gets thrown inside of my transaction, I want to roll back all changes made to the database and send the client a response saying that their operation has failed. So to do that, I'm going to need access to my session factory. Because remember, my session factory is what I create sessions from. But so far, my session factory is only available within my application. So in the interest of making this code as horrible as possible, I'm going to write a method on my application that returns a nice session. It's going to be called openSession, which returns session factory.openSession. This is something that would be handled by IOC if we had an IOC container, but because we don't, we're just going to make do with what we have. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say var using var session equals application.openSession. Then I'm going to say using var trans equals session.beginTransaction, because we want to open up a database transaction. Keep in mind, if something fails, I want to be able to roll back this transaction. So to do that, I'm going to say try catch exception ex. Then I'm going to say trans.rollback. Now, if the transaction succeeded, I'm going to do trans.commit. Otherwise, I'm going to do trans.rollback. Then I'm going to do log.error format error processing operation blah blah operation request dot operation code colon exception. So if an error comes in, I roll back the transaction and I log a message saying that the operation failed. Otherwise, I commit the transaction. So I'm going to go ahead and write the three methods that I want to go ahead and have. I want to have a register. Register is going to take in a session, username, a password, and an email. Just to make this code a little bit less ugly, I'm going to do this. Then I'm going to do login, session, password, email. Now the way I would normally handle this is through a command pattern. But unfortunately the command pattern will add some additional complexity to the code that I don't want to quite deal with right now. So I'm basically writing all this code that would be kind of written for me by a framework if I had one in place, just to kind of show you guys what we will be abstracting out later. So now I have my three methods, and these three methods are going to be responsible for processing these requests. And assuming I got into one of these three methods, I know that the client sent the appropriate information. So the next thing I'm going to do is every time that I send an on-operation request, I want to send an operation response to the client so that he knows that the server received the information and did not have an error. Notice that I have an on-operation response method here on my client, as well as an on-event. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create one more enum. I'm going to do Rune operation response, and there's going to be three responses. It's going to be invalid, which will be passed in when the response is not valid, obviously. There's if the client sent something dumb or didn't send anything that was formatted properly. I'm going to have invalid, I'll have failed validation, fatal error, and success. Actually, I'm going to do error and then fatal error. So what do you guys think is the difference between an error and a fatal error? Right, if it's recoverable. The way my distinction that I'm going to be using here is that an error is going to be that, okay, the client sent information that was properly formatted and my server understood it, but something about the input's wrong. Like let's say their username was too long to fit in the database. The fatal error means that you broke the server. Good job. Now the difference is that the error is going to send a message back. Fatal error is not going to send a message back. That means if I send an error back to this client, I'm going to expect the user to do something different. If I send a fatal error back to the client, that means the server broke. And then I'm going to make a Rune operation response parameter. Is that the way you spell parameter? It's bugging me. That's not how you spell parameter. Parameter has an E in it. That means I have to fix this one too, doesn't it? There we go. The create window? Do you mean this? The little thing that pops up over here, the generate? Yeah, that's Alt Insert. But keep in mind, in order to do that, you have to have focus on your Solution Explorer. So the two key combos you need to know is Control Alt L, which will bring focus over to your Solution Explorer, and then Alt Insert. So basically it allows you to really quickly create classes, enums, interfaces, whatever you might want to need. So my Rune operation response parameter is going to have one property called error message. And that's it. Because if the operation is invalid, I don't send anything back to the user. If the operation is an error, I do send the information back to the user. If it's a fatal error, I don't. If it's a success, I don't. So now inside of my Rune peer, what I'm going to do is add an else. So if I wasn't able to parse the operation code, I'm going to say send operation response, and the operation response is going to be a new operation response with an operation code of rune operation response of invalid. And the send parameters, I'm just going to pass in whatever send parameters were sent to me. So that's my first response. If they sent me a response or a request that I don't know how to parse, I send back an invalid. If they manage to cause an exception, then I send them back a fatal error. Otherwise, I'm going to handle the other types of messages inside of my send message, login, and register commands. So now that I have all this stuff stubbed out, I can go ahead and start writing the code that'll actually run this. So let's go ahead and implement my register first. So what my register is going to do is the first thing it's going to do is it's going to make sure that the username and the email are within the expected parameters and they're unique within my database. So you'll notice how I went ahead and I made my username and my email only X amount of characters long in my database. I want to make sure that the user not only filled in these parameters, but also that they made them the correct length. So I'm going to bring my database over here, take a look at my table just so I can remind myself of what I put in here, because I'm a horribly, horribly forgetful person. And let's start filling this method out. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say, I'm just going to make this really straightforward. If string is null or white space username, or string is null or white space password. I know this is horrible. I bet Christian is cringing right now, but it's the easiest way to do this stuff at this point. Then I'm going to send an operation response of new operation response, and then passing in operation code, which is going to be rune operation response dot error. Actually, you know what? I'm going to make a little method, a little helper method. I'm going to say private void send error string message, which is going to say send operation response, new operation response, passing in rune operation response dot error with a new dictionary of byte and object, passing in a byte of rune operation response parameter dot error message with a message of message, and then passing in send parameters. And the send parameters I'm going to send in is just going to be unreliable equals false. And what are you complaining about? You don't like the fact that you are a byte, or you are not a byte. There we go. And let's format this to make it a little less ugly. Okay, that's still pretty ugly, but we can work with that. Basic, what am I looking at? See, I don't even know what I'm doing. There we go. No, you go up there, you go down there. I think. Sorry, it's getting late. Okay, so now I have my send error. So I'm going to say send error, all fields are required. Return. I'm going to say if username.length is greater than 128, send error must be less than 128 characters long. Return. If email.length is greater than 200, send error, email must be less 200 characters. And the code repetition that I'm kind of inserting into here is kind of partially to make a point in that we will be factoring this out to be a little bit nicer here shortly. The problem is that whenever you factor things out to be a little bit nicer, you always introduce complexity. So I'm trying to keep things as simple as possible here. So the next thing I need to do is verify the uniqueness of the username in the past email. Now here's something interesting. Let's see here. If session.query user.any username equals username or email equals email, send error, and email must be unique, return. Okay, so in this case right here, I'm kind of introducing a potential problem knowingly, and I'm knowingly ignoring that potential problem and not caring. If somebody sent in so many commands so fast that made it so 2 register commands would be ran at the same time with both the same username and email, or what would happen is one would get inserted, but then the other one would pass this section. I've introduced a race condition. The likelihood of that happening is so incredibly slim. Not only that, it's being also handled by my database. My database is not going to allow my email or username to be non-unique. So this error message is nothing more than a courtesy to the user. And there is a way to get around this error message if you send in commands fast enough, but it's very, 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 very unlikely. So it's always good to be cognizant of potential race conditions that you introduce in your program, but it's also important to be able to realize which ones are important to address and which ones you can just leave behind without making your code any more complex. So hopefully that justification makes sense to everyone. So now what I have to do is I have to create a user equals new user, give him a username of username, give him a email of email, give him a created add of dt.utcnow, and give him a password of hashed password.from plain text, passing in password. I am fully aware that this method is not implemented yet. I'll implement that in a second. Then I'm going to do session save user, and then I'm going to say, I'm going to write one more little method. I'm going to write a method called private void send success string message, send operation response, new operation response, passing in a byte of rune operation response dot success with a new send parameters of unreliable being false. Why did I add a message parameter to that? I have no idea. Send success. I'm not going to worry about sending the ID of the user back to the client at this point. That'll be something we worry about a little bit later. So this is pretty much all the code that I need to write for my register method. It's mostly validation, and that's it. And that's how a lot of these things will be, really. So now let's go ahead and implement the from plain text method. Now the from plain text method is going to return a hash password based off plain text. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and hash this, or I'm going to generate a random salt, and then I'm going to hash that salt with my plain text password. So let's see here. I know I have this code already written somewhere, because I can't exactly remember. It's like what? There's a class that I need that I completely forgot. Let's see here. Please forgive me. Do you guys forgive me? All forgiven by one person. Really? I used a random object for that one? That was stupid of me. Fine, let's use a random object for our password hash. Okay, so the next, first of all though, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a few extension methods. I typically carry around a handful of extension methods for strings and for byte arrays. So I'm going to be taking advantage of those bits of code that I've written in the past and kind of carried around with me. Let's see, what do we need? We need these three. I'll keep this code up on the screen, and then I'm going to add one more byte array extensions. I really should get this in a class library and put it on NuGet, but I'm lazy. Alright, very simple methods that will save you a lot of time. I have my 2SHA-1, 2MD5 extension methods, then I have a 2-hex string extension method. Now all these methods do basically what they say they do. 2SHA-1 will create a new SHA-1, a 2MD5 will create a new MD5 based off a string. Byte array extensions 2-hex string will turn any byte array into a hex string, which is going to be necessary to save in the database because I stored my passwords as varchars instead of binaries. So, alrighty, so now that I have those written, I'll go ahead and write up my hash password. So my hash password, what I'm going to need to do is generate a salt and then hash it together with my plain text password. So I'm going to private static, I can't remember if the random is thread safe or not, so I'm just going to do it in here. Random equals new random. And then I'm going to say var salt equals random next 0 to 2000 to string. This is probably not the best way to do this, but the world won't end. So the hash is going to be plain text password plus salt dot 2SHA-1, and the salt is going to be salt. That's really not that secure, is it? Hold on, give me 1 second. Alright. I'm going to use a random number generator. I'm not going to use random. Now the great thing about the random number generators is... Wait a sec, what? Am I blind? Oh right, you can't do that one. Give me 1 second. Oh, come on. Why do I always keep on forgetting this, the actual base type? Why can't this be easy? RNG Crypto Service Provider is what I want. RNG Crypto Service Provider. There we go. So, now my salt is not going to be random.next. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a byte array. Now, if I look at my database, my password salt is constrained to 32 characters. That means it's going to be 16 bytes. So I'm going to create a byte array of 16 bytes. Because remember, there's 2 nibbles in a byte. Then I'm going to do random.getBytes, passing in my bytes array. Then I'm going to say var salt equals bytes.toHexString. There we go. Now I have a nice, relatively secure hashing salting algorithm in place. Then finally, just because I want to go ahead and finish this method off, or finish this class off, I'm going to write a method on it called, or public bool equals plain text, string plain text, and then this is going to be return plain text plus salt dot to SHA-1 equals hash. So a very straightforward, easy to reuse class that you can use for your hashing and salting needs for passwords. So now that I have that in place, now my Rune peer should allow me to register for accounts. So let's go ahead and write our client and see what happens. So in the client, I'm going to add, where's my client? Here's my client. I'm going to go ahead and, let's see, just keep this really simple and dirty and awful. And just to make Christian hate me even more. So email, password, username, delete my messages for now. I'll worry about that later. I want to initialize my email to empty string, password to empty string, username to empty string, just so the GUI doesn't throw a fit, which it likes to do. I'm going to remove all of this code, remove my send server code, and remove my on event code. That stuff was all just for testing purposes. Then on my on GUI, let's go ahead and say GUI dot, let's do GUI layout. GUI layout's fun. Let's begin a horizontal with a GUI layout option, or GUI layout dot width of, I don't know, let's just do 800 by 600. Then GUI layout dot end horizontal. So the first thing we need is our password. So our password's going to be, or first thing we need, let's do our user, or let's do a label first. GUI layout dot label username equals GUI layout dot text field username email password. I know you guys are probably cringing at this code right now. I am too, but I really just want to see this code working before we head off today. And then I'll do another label up here called then I'm going to do if GUI layout dot button dot register, then register. So I'm going to create a Boolean up here, private Boolean. Actually, I'm going to create an enum called enum game manager state. It's going to have 3 states: a form state, a sending state, an error state, and a success state. And then I'm going to say state, I'm going to default it to the form state. Then on GUI, I'm going to say if state equals form or state equals error, print this, else if state equals sending, just do, I'm going to bring this horizontal out, actually, of my if statement, because I want the horizontal to always be begun and ended. So if it's sending, then I'll do GUI layout.label.sending, else if state equals success, GUI layout.label success, and then if there's an error, so if our state is an error, then I'm going to go ahead and say if state equals error, then GUI layout.label error equals bleh. And what's bleh? Well, bleh is going to be a private string error. Alright, so there's our awesome registration form. Last thing I need is an actual method that will tell the server I want to register. So I'm going to write a register method that's going to pass in the username, password, and email. And why I'm passing in fields into a method that's an instance member of the class I'm in, it's just cleaner that way. And it makes it easier to refactor this into an object, which we should be doing. So here's our straightforward on GUI method. Register for now, all I'm going to do is say state equals sending, just to test my state machine real fast and make sure I didn't introduce any bugs there. And clearly I did because nothing's happening. Let me make sure that my game manager is even added. Yeah, somehow my game manager got removed. Ooh, that's because I forgot to actually load up my scene. Alright, double click on scene 1, make sure that main camera has my game manager, which it does. Hit run, see what happens. Ah! I did not mean to begin a horizontal, I meant to begin a vertical. I always get those two confused. I don't know why. There we go. Username, email, password. When I hit register, it says sending. So now let's go ahead and write the code that's actually responsible for telling the server to register our account. So I'm going to do Photon op custom. The op custom code is going to be, remember how we have a reference to our base project, which is up here? So what I can do here is I can just grab my Rune operation code dot register, and then I'm going to pass in a dictionary, a byte and object, and I'm going to set send reliable to true. So register, dictionary, byte and object, and true. Now, my dictionary is going to require a username, password, and email. So I'm going to send a Rune operation code parameter dot username of username email, password, and I hit Control P on accident, which, there we go. And honestly, that's really about it as far as sending that information to the server to go ahead and process that request. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to handle the on operation response. So I'm going to say response equals operation response dot operation code, and I'm going to cast this into a Rune operation response. Then I'm going to say if response is an error, then I'm going to say state equals error, and error equals response, or sorry, operation response dot parameters at cast to byte Rune operation response parameters dot error message. And what are you complaining? Oh yeah, I have to cast you to a string, don't I? Else if response equals fatal error, then I'm going to say state equals error, and I'm going to set the message to you broke the server. Otherwise, if response equals success, actually I'm going to do if it's fatal error or if it's invalid. Otherwise, if it's success, set state to success. So actually, that pretty much completes all of the code. So let's go ahead and see what happens when I run the client. I have no idea what's going to happen. Ooh, let's make sure that my server's up to date first, because that would be miserable if it wasn't. So I'm going to go ahead and trigger a server restart and jump into my logs and pay close attention to what's happening in my logs. So Control-Shift-B, application ending. Of course, I don't get an application started, so let me Control-Shift-B again. Application started. Sweet. So now if I jump into Unity, I can hit run. So let's hit register and see what happens. Error, all fields are required. You guys see that? Huh? Anyone? So that message is actually coming from my server. If you remember, on my Rune peer, in my register method, if either any of these are null or white space, it says all fields are required. So username, Nelson, email, nelson@3dbuzz.com, password, blah, register. Username and email must be unique. Remember how I created that user a while ago with that same username and password or email? Let's go ahead and remove that from the server because his password's wrong anyway. Or his password's not hashed. Delete rows, apply, success. And if I jump back into my MySQL workbench, select rows, I now have a row. Nelson3dbuzz.com, username Nelson, password salt, and password hash, all set to their appropriate. This lag is killing me. Appropriate things. As far as breaking it, what I could do is I could jump into my, I'm going to go ahead and stop Unity. If I wanted to break it, I could jump into my Rune peer and throw an exception somewhere. So I can say throw new invalid operation exception and build. And build harder to make it actually restart. Now if I jump back into Unity, hit run, and hit register, it says error, you broke the server. But not only that, I also have a nice little stack trace inside of my error log, so I'm able to actually go through and look at what caused it to break without the entire server dying, which is important. So let's go ahead and unbreak the server. All right, to wrap things up today, what I want to do is I want to get logging in to work. Now, logging in, I'm going to have to make a operation response that's a little bit more complicated than just passing in success, but I'll do that next week. For now, I just want to send in either an error or a success. So the first thing I want to do is I want to say var user equals session. Remember, session is the hibernate object that allows us to interact with the database. I want to query over my user entity. I want to say single or default email equals email. Then I want to say if user is null, or if not, user.password.equals plaintext password. Send error, email or password is incorrect. Return, otherwise send success. So to people who are new to and Hibernate, I mean, you have to admit that's pretty straightforward code, right? I mean, it was a bit of ceremony in order to get it to where it is right now, but once you get it set up, it's really rather straightforward to work with. Someone just sent me a paste bin. It's a SHA Manage. I'm not familiar with that class. I always use the SHA crypto provider doohickey thing. And actually there's a different crypto provider doohickey thing that I should be using instead because it has better performance, but I completely forgot what it is, so I'll have to look that up later. Alright, so now we have our logging in, so let's go ahead and make our client interact with this. Let me go ahead and first of all make my server restart. So application started or ended. Then for some reason I have to do this twice. I don't know why. I'll have to figure that out. It's really getting on my nerves. Application started. So our server's up to date. So jump into the client and let's make a login form. So instead of a state called form, whatever, I'll just, this is going to be ugly. It's going to be very ugly, but it'll work. Rune game login, and then I'm going to change this from email to register email, register password, and then I'm going to create a private string login email, private string login password. I know people are like crying right now at this code, but we're about out of time, so I just want to at least get logging in to work. Login email equals GUI layout dot text field login email GUI layout label email password login password if GUI layout dot button login, then login with login email and login password. Okay, so what's login going to do? Well, the first thing it's going to do is set the state to sending, so the form disappears. Then it's going to send an op custom. And I'm just going to copy and paste this because I'm lazy. So, instead of passing in a register, I'm going to pass in a login. And I don't need to send the username because all I need to log in is my email and my password. Now everything else with the code should work because I'm still am receiving that same error if I wasn't able to log in, so that's all good. And I'm still receiving the success if I was able to log in. So let's jump back into Unity and see what this code does. So my login, if I just hit login, it says error, email or password is incorrect. However, if I did nelson@3dbuzz.com, now the email is correct, but the password still isn't. So if I give the password of test, actually I completely forgot what my password was. Let's create a new account. Username, email nelson2@3dbuzz.com, password of test, register. So now it says success. So now I'm going to jump out of Unity, jump back into Unity, say nelson2 at test login and success. And just to verify, I can go ahead and give it a correct email, but not a correct password, and I get error, email or password is incorrect. But if I just typed in test, I would be able to log in. Wouldn't you want to flag an account when it's logged in to prevent multiple clients from logging in? Yeah, that'll be handled later. We didn't get to it today, but what I was going to do is each logged in client would create a new, what I typically call a session. And then I'll make it so only one account can be logged in at a time. And then those different sessions will be able to communicate with each other. But that's going to have to be next week. Alright, so I'm going to run outside real fast, grab some water. If anybody has any final questions, anything else that they would like me to just take a cursory overview of, any code they would guys would like to see, just post in the questions panel, and I'll be right back. And we're back. So we got a couple questions. One of them asked about Photon encryption. Yes, Photon does support encryption, and it's very transparent and easy to use, but I'm not worrying about that right now. I'm just trying to get some quick and dirty code written so that we have some obvious points of making the code a little bit more clear. As you guys have noticed, I do have, a bit of a coding style where you'll see that I have my methods broken out based off levels of abstraction. So right here we have a bunch of code that's simply responsible for some sort of ancillary concerns, such as opening a session, beginning a transaction, committing or rolling back the transaction, and sending responses and stuff like that. This stuff is going to be refactored into something a lot cleaner, but I wanted to get the simple code written out just so people knew where those abstractions were coming from, and so that we can get something up and running faster sooner than later. And then all of these methods are going to be broken out into their own classes, because a command pattern, if anybody's familiar with that term, is very appropriate for this sort of logic that we have. Yes, I realize that sending your password in the clear every time is not such a good idea. Do you think that paying $12 to get LogFusion Pro is worth it? Yes, I really do like LogFusion Pro. Gives you a lot of nice features. I mean, the base interface is very simple. But for example, I can go ahead and set up highlighting. So if I wanted to go ahead and say, I want to highlight anything that has an error, I can say match text error, give it a back color of that sort of red and a front color of that sort of white, and say case insensitive, and then hit OK, and then hit OK. Oh, that didn't do it right. That's because, let's do that. And, oh, because I have to actually enable that matching. So now my errors are highlighted. You can do stuff like that. You can set up grid rows, which is also very handy. So if I just wanted to say, right click and say, edit columns, add columns for tab separated values. Let's do 5 columns, hit OK. Now I've columnified this, which unfortunately doesn't work very well for additional stack traces, but it does work well when you have a lot of information like this. Yes, columnified is a technical term. Okay, so yeah, I really rather do like this program, and I use it for all of my log4net type stuff. Okay, so we have a question. I would love to see hashed password class again in the login send message functions of Rune Peer. Yeah, hash password is a very straightforward class that just makes dealing with hash passwords very easy. We just have a class that has 2 properties, a hash and a salt, then a static method called fromPlainText, which constructs a hash password from a plain text password. All it does is generate a random salt and return a new hash password with that salt in it. Then we have this equals plaintext method that does the opposite. So it'll tell you if this hash password equals the plaintext of another password. One question I had was actually from last week. I noticed there wasn't a homework assignment or option to submit for the first session. There's going to be really no homework for this particular class. However, I do encourage people to jump on the forums and discuss, what people have been creating, what people have been playing with, what kind of questions people have. This isn't really constructed as a class where there will be homework. This is more of a class where I'm going to be throwing code on the screen. So hopefully everybody's enjoying this format and learning stuff, because that's the whole point. Might be getting ahead of ourselves, but as far as gameplay goes and server transactions, how often do you actually write to the database for a client player? Like if you're moving around the world, how often would you store that? It depends. Once we start talking about an actual MMO, things are going to be a little bit more complicated. However, this sort of structure is suited for something like Rune Game and is suited for aspects of an MMO. So, for example, this sort of structure would be something we would use for inventory management and chatting and stuff like that, but we wouldn't necessarily use for moving around the game, because you're right, once you start talking about moving around the game, you start talking about sending messages, many messages per frame, which could cause problems when you have code like this. What I would do instead for that sort of code is I would have the messages being processed and then the information being stored asynchronously, so that the storage of where the user is in the game world doesn't conflict or doesn't add additional overhead to the user actually moving around in the game world. But again, that's a exception to the rule. The reason I say that's an exception is the majority of the kind of messages you're going to be handling, you're going to want to be transactional. And that's why I've wrapped every single operation that gets sent in with a database transaction. But not necessarily everything is going to be wrapped in a database transaction. But fortunately for Rune Game, that is going to be how things are done. But once we start talking about moving around real time, then things get more complicated. But again, though, stuff like this is appropriate for things that you would do for, I guess Java wants to update. Of course you do. I hate Java. Go away. Anyway, what was I saying? Yeah, so this sort of stuff is stuff you would do for inventory management, chatting, selecting skills, and welcome to Java. Ugh, I hate this thing. Oh yes, Rune Slinger, sorry. Okay, so I think that's just about wraps up all the questions that I saw. So I'm going to go ahead and close out the video, and I guess I'll see all you future people next week. So again, if you have any questions, post in the forums. There are dedicated forums for the MMO, and I do not want a free Ask toolbar installed in my browser. I don't know that anybody would, and it's kind of sad that Oracle is that desperate for money that they would even put that in the installer of Java, and frankly, it's fairly pathetic. Anyway, I'll see all you guys later.